The Miscarriages of Anne Boleyn. On the 29th of January 1536, two significant events unfolded in Tudor England, events that would ripple through history. At Peterborough Cathedral, the first wife of Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, was laid to rest after her death just a few weeks earlier. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, a much more private but equally tragic moment occurred. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, miscarried what would turn out to be her final pregnancy. The loss of this child would mark the beginning of the end for Anne, sealing her fate in a court already teetering on the edge of political and personal upheaval. Anne's miscarriage did not happen in a vacuum. Eustace Chapuys, the Spanish ambassador and a fierce opponent of Anne, reported that she had attributed her loss to the intense shock that she experienced after learning about a near-fatal accident that had befallen Henry just days earlier. The king, while jousting, had been thrown from his horse and lay unconscious for 2 hours. In the Tudor era, any kind of emotional upset, especially during pregnancy, was thought to endanger both the mother and the unborn child. Chapuys, however, was sceptical of this explanation. He wrote that Anne had been informed of Henry's accident in a carefully measured manner, and those around her downplaying the severity to avoid alarming her. Though Chapuys dismissed Anne's shock as the cause, it is not difficult to imagine that the news weighed heavily on her. Henry's accident threw the court into a panic, as it raised the terrifying prospect that the king could die without a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. Had Henry perished, Anne would have been faced with an immense political struggle to protect the rights of her daughter, Elizabeth, against the ambitions of Henry's firstborn, Princess Mary. Anne, already under immense pressure to deliver a male heir, would have been left in a precarious position, both as a queen and as a mother. The anxiety surrounding Henry's accident must have been overwhelming, regardless of how gently the news was broken to her. Chapuys goes on to note that when Henry visited Anne following her miscarriage, their interaction was cold and distant. Anne blamed the miscarriage not only on the stress for the king's accident, but also on the emotional pain that she felt after witnessing Henry's growing affection for Jane Seymour, one of her ladies-in-waiting. Anne had even caught Henry with Jane sitting on his knee. The image of her husband, the king, sharing such an intimate moment with another woman would have been a crushing blow to Anne, who was desperately trying to hold on to her marriage and her position at court. What followed was a chilling exchange. Chapuys reports that during this visit, Henry remarked that it seemed God would not bless him with male children. This statement was more than just an offhand comment. It echoed the reasoning that he had used to justify his annulment from Catherine of Aragon. Henry had convinced himself that this marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had failed to produce a surviving male heir. Now, with Anne also unable to provide a male child, the king's mind began to turn towards the possibility that his union with Anne, too, was divinely condemned. Within days of the miscarriage, Chapuys recorded that Henry had begun to grumble about being deceived into marrying Anne. He complained that sortilege or prophecies had falsely promised him a son, and that the marriage was therefore invalid. Though Chapuys was no friend of Anne's and his accounts are often biased, this sentiment appears to have been shared by the king himself, as Henry's dissatisfaction with Anne only grew in the weeks that followed. The tragic irony of Anne's miscarriage was that the baby she lost was a boy, the very son that Henry had so desperately longed for. Contemporary reports, including that of Chapuys, confirm that the fetus appeared to be male and about 3.5 months old. Despite later rumours and slander, there was no indication at the time that the fetus was deformed in any way. Decades later, it would sensationally claim that Anne had miscarried a shapeless mass of flesh, but his allegations were grounded more in his animosity towards Anne than in fact. In reality, all contemporary accounts affirm that the miscarriage was a typical, if heartbreaking, loss. This miscarriage marked the beginning of Anne's irreversible downfall. Her relationship with Henry had been strained for months, and after the loss of their son, it never fully recovered. According to Chapuys, Henry scarcely spoke to Anne in the days following the tragedy, remarking bitterly that God did not seem willing to grant him male children. He then left her to recover at Greenwich, as he had once left Catherine behind after her own failures to produce a male heir. It was clear that Henry's affection had already shifted, most notably towards Jane Seymour, and Anne was rapidly losing her grip on both the king and the crown. In the weeks that followed, the seeds of Anne's destruction were quietly sown. While Anne tried to recover from the physical and emotional toll of her miscarriage, Henry and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, began to consider how they might rid the king of his second wife. The miscarriage, which could have solidified Anne's position, had resulted in a healthy son. Instead, came the final chapter in her tragic story. Within 4 months, she would be arrested, tried, and executed, leaving behind the daughter who would one day surpass all expectations, Elizabeth I. Anne Boleyn's miscarriage on that fateful day in January 1536 was not just a personal tragedy, but a turning point in English history. It set in motion the events that would lead to her death, change the course of the Tudor dynasty, and eventually alter the religious and political landscape of England forever.